Hey everyone, this is Natalie Ivey, the host of the HR Investigations podcast, and I'm excited to bring you part 2 of a 2-part series with my special guest, Ivna Curi. Ivna is a communications expert, speaker, podcast host, and author of Unapologetically Speaking. In this show, we're going to delve into how to handle an aggressive boss or interviewee and share some tips and best practices to stand your ground assertively.
Welcome to the HR Investigations podcast, exploring the issues, challenges, strategies, and solutions. Sponsored by RPCHR and hosted by Natalie Ivey, an HR consultant, licensed PI, and author of the best-selling book, How to Conduct Internal Investigations, a practical guide for human resource professionals. And now, here's Natalie.
Hey everybody, I'm Natalie Ivey, and welcome to the HR Investigations podcast. I am really excited about having my guest, Ivna Curi, back on my show. And today she's going to be just sharing her wisdom as an assertive communications professional. And the topic for today is standing your ground, assertive communication with an aggressive boss or interviewee. Now, in our last episode, we had some conversation that was really awesome about dealing with a passive boss and what happens when individuals are just not handling situations well, not managing with assertive communication and the consequences of that. In this episode, we're going to kind of flip the script on that, and we're going to talk about what happens when you're dealing with people who may be behaving too aggressively and some of the things that you need to do. Now, before we get started, for my listening audience that may not know you, Ivna, would you share with the group a little bit about who you are, where you come from, and tell everybody about your book and your podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like as you said, we all encounter aggressive types. And one of the top challenges that people come to me with is I'm scared of speaking up because I'm going to come across as aggressive. People tell me that I'm too aggressive, I'm too difficult, I'm abrasive, I'm all these adjectives, especially women and minorities tend to experience this. And the reality is most people can't quite understand the difference between assertive and aggressive. And there are very distinct differences in how we communicate so that we can get our point across, influence others, and maintain positive relationships. So that's what I help teams do, individuals, organizations, cultivate these courageous cultures where people speak up assertively, respectfully, and in a way that solves problems. And you've come to my podcast. I encourage everyone to check that out. It's called Speak Your Mind Unapologetically podcast, where we have stories and examples of how to speak up assertively in the workplace. And there's a book called Unapologetic Voice with 101 stories on how to have these bold, assertive conversations as well.
I really think that's awesome because there are so many folks that I talk with that, and even just clients, and for my listening audience, I've been in consulting for a long time, running RPC Human Resources out of Daytona Beach, Florida, and working with clients. A lot of times business owners, they get into business because they know their craft, whether it is a bakery or it's a trucking company. Doesn't matter. They know their business, they know their craft, but what they often struggle with is the people part of their business. And they really just don't know how to have some of these crucial conversations. And a lot of it is the kind of avoidance of conflict. But the other problem is you have some who are really just very, very aggressive. And the way that they communicate is abrupt and abrasive, and they're almost like a bulldozer and rolling over others in conversation. And, so being too passive or being too aggressive, these opposites are both sort of communication behaviors that really create a lot of problems. And as I said in my previous episode, these are a lot of the things that show up in HR offices all over the country, all over the world, actually. I've got global clients. They have same problems in Mexico as they do here or in Canada. So it isn't just a U.S. kind of thing, but a lot of HR professionals have to dive into a lot of conflicts, especially between managers and employees. And a lot of it is around this communication stuff. So can you define exactly what sort of things show up when an employee has an aggressive boss? What does that kind of look like?
Obviously, when the employee feels like, the boss is not listening to them, obviously there's the yelling and making threats of some sort. If you don't do this, you'll see what's going to happen. A lot of public criticism takes place, and not a lot of praise. as very typical of an aggressive boss. Criticism, usually the right ideal ratio of praise to criticism is like 4 to 6 praise to 1 constructive criticism. And usually it's the opposite for aggressive bosses. They tend to want to start a meeting with their opinion and end it with their opinion and get things and do things their way. They don't listen very well. They don't acknowledge others very well. They interrupt a lot of people very often. So employees tend to feel ignored and dismissed. And therefore, they don't want to contribute that much anymore because it's also risky to speak up. You're not heard, and there's a chance that the boss is going to bulldozer over you and be aggressive, threaten you, or just even being impatient is an expression of aggression. And the thing about aggressive bosses is that they're not necessarily trying to be mean and hurt you. They're just trying to control the situation. They believe that that's their edge to be productive and get things done. And that if they're not aggressive, they're going to lose control and they're not going to be effective bosses, right? That's inherently their belief. So it's not that they're trying to hurt you or micromanage you or be inflexible. They're simply trying to do their work well. And that's the only way they know how to do it, right? And another thing that they tend to do is unrealistic expectations. So unreasonable demands, and they don't know how to compromise around things. So it's really hard to negotiate with them.
Yeah, very much so. I'm thinking back to my early part of my career when I had a leader who was like that, and I did push back with him though. And for folks who know me, I'm definitely not someone who's a fragile dove, and so he wasn't expecting it. I was 27 years old, and he was probably double my age, but he was someone who was behaving in a way that just I was not going to tolerate. And I stood my ground, and I just said, "Are you done?" He wasn't expecting that, and it was a bit of a flippant remark, and he just couldn't believe it. His head kind of snapped when I pushed back, because he was berating and belittling me and blaming me for things of which I had absolutely nothing to do. He was making some incorrect assumptions, and so I just sort of let him prattle on in his aggressive manner. And then when I said, "Are you done?" And then he said, "Oh, so you're going to be a smartass now?" And I said, "No, I'm not going to be a smartass, but I said, I think I need to provide a little clarity." And I said, and when I finish, you're going to owe me an apology. And I really did. I just kind of very much stood my ground. I leaned back on another boss's desk, and I just very matter-of-factly. And then his eyebrows raised, and he just really had a lot of the old proverbial egg on his face, because he had his facts completely wrong. And so I just sort of let him kind of marinate in his own juice right there. And then he owed an apology, and then he shook my hand. But that's one thing that I think that I learned, at least assertive communication. My mom was a registered nurse for 42 years, and my mom had to grow up pretty quickly. My grandfather was a coal miner, and he passed away I wasn't even thought of. My mother was 12 years old when he passed. My grandmother was not doing very well after her husband was lost. And so my mother had to grow up very quickly at age 12. She had to assume a lot of responsibility. They were really very poor. They lived in a little town called Middleport, Pennsylvania, which is a coal mining town near Pottsville, Pennsylvania, where Yingling beer is brewed, by the way. Mom was someone who she had naturally, think, leadership quality. She was definitely a dominant style. If we were to do the disc profile on my mom, she was someone, I think, who really had to grow up as kind of a survivor. And so because of that, she was just a very strong personality. And so a lot of, I think the way that I sort of developed was modeling a lot of my mom. Now, I've learned tact and diplomacy a lot more so than Mother had. There were times Mother lacked a little bit of the finesse. And so I certainly learned from some of that. But, it's interesting, when you have not necessarily seen good models for how to stand your ground. Like you mentioned that, maybe some of your clients, the only way that they know how to communicate is by the models they've seen. Case in point, I had a young woman. She was a young Black female who worked for me, and she happened to be the baby of the family. And she was very much a bully. She was very aggressive. But what I learned about her is the way that she was raised. She knew that she had to fight for whatever she wanted. If she wanted that extra biscuit on the dinner table when she had all brothers and she was the baby, she knew that she had to squawk the loudest in order to get what she wanted. So a lot of that was that kind of condition. And even the way that she even admitted to me later that the way that you got something done was to yell louder. The way you got what you wanted was to be argumentative. And so from her standpoint, she just seemed to think that that's the best way forward. But it really goes back to what you said about control, that locus of control. And that was really kind of her issue. And that required an awful lot of coaching to help to smooth some of those rough edges with her, because I can tell you, her conduct at times was really almost to the point where it was a disciplinary warning. And she was always kind of right on that cusp. But I just said to her she was trending below expectations on her annual review in treating others respectfully. And she was abysmal at working collaboratively with others. It had to be her way or the highway. But over time and through some serious coaching, and I offered a mentor to her who was not even myself. I gave her another colleague of mine who mentored her. And she really, really began to flourish. And she recognized through that influence, what does being assertive sound like versus what I'm doing now? She needed to see that, right? Yeah. So can you share a little bit about what to do when you are working for that aggressive boss? What are some key tips that you can share with our listeners that maybe, 2, maybe 3 tips on how to deal with someone who is being aggressive?
Yeah. And you shared a great story as well, how you dealt with your aggressive boss. And here's one more thing on what you were saying, because that was a great story about, how our upbringing and what works through trial and error as a child to get what we want or to be recognized and rewarded, we carry on to our professional lives, and it doesn't always work. And some people, and probably that lady that you were mentioning, has this mindset, like, I just need to do whatever it takes to get stuff done. So they are success driven. They want to get things done, and they feel like, hey, whatever it takes, right? And if people don't like it, they need to toughen up, or they're too sensitive. It's all about winning and being right and getting stuff done. So it's just about really helping people understand that they can get stuff done and be even more productive by communicating in the right way.
Absolutely. So I think that it's also that saying you can't fix what you don't acknowledge. And I discussed that in a previous podcast where Dr. Phil talks about that. You can't change what you don't acknowledge. So I think the first thing is being open to the feedback. And, in my experience as a leader and, in working with my employee, her name was Leslie, where Leslie had a lot of, if you will, sunshine blown up her trousers for a long time because she was an aggressive team member. Previous bosses, I think, were even intimidated by her. Well, working for me, I recognized very quickly that if I don't take some action at my level to help to smooth some of the rough edges with her, she's either A, going to get fired, or B, at the very least, it's going to keep her from getting promoted because she's just not diplomatic enough. And got to the point, again, where, team members just didn't necessarily want to stay on her team. They were wanting to bid off the next shift bid to get away from her and bid for another team. And, there were things showing up. But what you have to do, I think, is certainly acknowledge when you've had someone give you some feedback, especially a boss, instead of being dismissive of it, you need to listen. You need to listen and then ask some questions. And you can certainly chime in here. Ask some questions. Well, give me some examples of where you think I've been too aggressive. And then listen to what they have to say. Listen to the meaningful feedback. And what happens sometimes, those who are aggressive, like, but just never let me explain. Let me explain the reason why I said that. And they want to get into defense mode. If you see yourself doing that, you're the problem. You need to listen.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great tip, especially if you're aggressive. But I also wanted to make sure to share examples if you have an aggressive boss and what to do with that,
sure.
That situation. So what we tend to do with an aggressive boss is we tend to try to communicate less and wait until the last minute to reveal something. So that's where I think you mentioned earlier the situation where people just wait till almost the last minute or time's up to say, hey, I'm not going to make it, or I wasn't able to do this. And they're just avoiding that difficult person. And it's natural. It's unpleasant. However, that doesn't work. You want to manage that individual and that boss's expectation over time and ask for that feedback like you were talking about throughout the process, throughout the project. because what you don't want is to end up in a situation where you don't meet their expectations and then suddenly they're stepping all over you, right? You want to be able to manage them throughout the process. And you also talked about acknowledging, and that works as well with an aggressive boss. There's actually an assertiveness technique, which is all about partially acknowledging whatever they say, agreeing with something. Okay. So that's a great way to diffuse the conflict and tension, which is, hey, I understand. I totally get that this is, what your expectation were. I understand that you're frustrated. I agree that this should have been done by now. I agree that we could have done this better. You're right that there's a lot at stake here. Find something to agree with. Find something. There's always something that you can agree with your boss when they're frustrated, when they're angry, when they're coming in aggressively. And they're going to feel heard. They're going to feel like, okay, they agree with me. And then that negative energy is going to come down, and that's going to allow you to have a more productive, assertive conversation with them at that point. So acknowledging their perspective, acknowledging their feelings, and partially agreeing with what they're saying is a great first step to handle that. And then following that with I statements about what you need, what you feel, what you want from them, and letting them know how that's going to help them as well. If they collaborate with you, what is the positive consequence for them?
Yeah.
So they can be on your side.
Yeah, excellent. I think that's a great way. And also one tip that I will share is whenever having a candid discussion with a boss, let's say you are working with a boss who has been like a bulldozer, and you're really just feeling very blue about the whole situation, and you're even contemplating leaving, what I recommend is trying to choose a neutral location to have a discussion with the boss. Don't go into the boss's office. That's their power base. That's where they're going to have maybe an assistant coming and going, or the phone ringing, and you're not going to be able to have a really clear discussion. So if you could maybe go off-site, maybe go to a coffee shop, maybe have lunch, or you just find a conference room where you can sit and have a conversation. The other thing I also recommend, just strategically, is if you can maybe go to a coffee shop or a restaurant, don't sit in a booth, because you're sitting directly across from them, where it becomes like the table in the middle in the booth is like a tennis net, where it becomes you are against them. But if you can choose a table where you're sitting kind of on the corner, one of like a 4-top table in the middle of a coffee shop, you're sitting somewhat on the same side, where it tends to even lend itself to being a little bit more collaborative with the discussion. I find that a neutral location also not only minimizes distractions, but it kind of takes away a little bit of the power base, where the boss has themselves behind a big, huge walnut desk, and you're sitting in the chair across the table where you already feel disadvantaged. You already may be intimidated even by the space itself. So you've got to create the right environment before you're going to share some things with your boss. When you use those I messages that Ivna talked about with, I need, or this is how I feel. These are the things that I'm really looking for, and guidance and so on.
So having an aggressive boss is not as bad as it's. I mean, it's hard, it's difficult, but there are other communication patterns in managers that are even more difficult, like passive aggressive, because at least you know where they stand. Mm-hmm. So the goal here is to be able to regain some control and be able to have open conversations. And the good news is that we all have a lot more control over that than we think we do. If we just know how to have these conversations, like you said, the neutral territory, knowing how to start, disarm the critical side of them, and get them on a neutral space, mentally, physically, that allows you to engage in a conversation and do so in a way that really removes any of the defensiveness and negativity, and pushes them towards a positive territory. Where you want to go, you have to be clear on what you want in order to have a conversation with someone like that, so you can guide them in that direction. Yeah. But that's the good news. You have absolute control over the conversation if you learn how to do so in the right way. It's hard, but it's absolutely manageable.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that it is a little bit easier to deal with someone who is more aggressive, because they are rather predictable. It's easier. And someone who is passive, it really is difficult, as we talked about in our previous episode. But and I think, instead of fearing it, is also doing a dress rehearsal. You can practice what this is going to sound like. Use an app on your phone. I use voice memo on my iPhone all the time. And just think about what your opening statement's going to be when you're going to have a sit down with your boss and you want to talk about your relationship. Envision what your outcome is, as Ivna said. When you think about what success in that meeting with your boss to talk about the way you are interacting with one another, think about that outcome. That's your goal. That's your destination. And then the how to get there, practicing that conversation, maybe even with a spouse, maybe with a friend or another coworker who happens to even know that individual. That's even better because then they can somewhat present objections, or they can share with you the reality of what you might expect in the conversation so that you could even do that dress rehearsal. Because I can tell you, once you've practiced that once or twice, that will definitely help to boost your confidence when you go into that meeting and use a number of these tips that Ivna has so kindly shared with us today. So that is it for us today on the HR Investigations podcast. I hope you had a number of tips that you jotted down as some great takeaways that you can apply those in your everyday. And Ivna, once again, it's been a pleasure having you on, and definitely we're going to have you back again because I think we're going to get a lot of good mail after these episodes. All right.
Thank you so much, Natalie, and everyone who's listening.
All right. Fantastic. All right, gang, until next time on the HR Investigations podcast, I bid you farewell. All right, everybody. See ya.
Thanks for joining us today on the HR Investigations podcast. Be sure to subscribe, like, and share the show with any colleagues who will benefit from our strategies and solutions. For free bonus resources, simply visit hr-investigations.com. And remember, if you'd like some help with improving your investigative skills, or if your organization is in need of an external investigator to help with the case, please get in touch with us. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.